Hello and welcome to FortiGuard Live. I'm Derek Manky, and joining me today is Geri Revay. How are you doing, Geri?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, great. It's good to speak with you. I get the pleasure to speak with you every day. But today we get to speak to a wider audience and really discuss some of the good research that you've been doing, what we've seen in terms of ransomware, in terms of wiper malware as well, because there is some connections that we're making. So I just, this ransomware is now a household name, right? We talk about it all the time. We've highlighted it for years in our threat landscape report, as most of our viewers should be aware. Throughout last year, we saw an unprecedented rise. We saw that with FortiGuardLIVE is almost an 1,100% increase in the first half last year. That really barrage or surge has continued ever since, right? With ransomware, so it's not going away. And in fact, it's become a crowded space now. You actually called this out in one of your blogs, specifically those words. It's a crowded space. And I wanted to talk about that, right? Because first of all, I remember doing my first conference presentation on ransomware, I think almost 15 years ago. And, back then, as we know, it was just data cryptor, not many of them. And they didn't use strong encryption algorithms. And then there's this whole rise of data cryptors. But it's gone much beyond that, right? And again, we're not just talking about one or two pieces of ransomware. Like in 2015, CryptoWall was the big one back then, but it was all eyes on CryptoWall and one piece of ransomware. Now, as we call it in a threat landscape report, we're dealing with handfuls, right? Like 10, 15 plus different ransomware groups, and that keeps growing, doesn't it?
Yeah, and we can see that it really became a business. So it's not anymore just like hackers trying to get some money, but it really became a business model. And as we see ransomware as a service also grow, and see how attackers are also organizing themselves to divide the different tasks of collecting credentials and then selling that to other operators who would then deploy the ransomware. And then there is this whole model how to share the collected money at the end of the day. So yeah, it's really becoming a serious business at this point.
Yeah, the as a service model is definitely driving that too. And what's interesting is it's not the innovation, right? I think that's another thing we've seen diversification. So, i.e., more stakeholders, more groups, the as a service model and affiliates. Definitely more money. I mean, if we just look at the movement of funds and using crypto and just the sheer amount of money that's moving, that's also really ballooned over the last several years and actually complicating the problem more. But then, on top of that, I think what's the most interesting is looking at the technology, right? And we have now, as we know, we've gone from just the data cryptors to extortion models, double extortion, triple extortion. We have also now this threat, and we talked about this in our threat predictions of wiper malware that is starting to, the line is starting to become muddled, right? Like some of this technology we've seen inadvertently in ransomware attacks. We haven't seen it in a full-blown tactical or scale where they're really doubling down on this yet. I think that's coming, but I know you've done a blog on this, sort of breaking down wiper malware, different technologies that's being used with that, and there has been some connection for ransom as well, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting. In terms of the relation between ransomware and wiper, it very often happens that wiper malware pretends to be a ransomware for various reasons. There were examples in the past, like the German Viper, which pretended to be a ransomware, but at the end it just basically destroyed files in the hopes that the victims are just going to pay anyway, even though that they are not going to get their files back at the end. Obviously, this is just a short-lived campaign, because once it gets out that you cannot recover your files, then nobody is going to pay the ransom.
Yeah.
But the other interesting aspect is when the wiper pretends to be ransomware to cover up the activity it does. For instance, NotPetya was a really good example for that. It did everything what the ransomware is supposed to do in a very sophisticated way. And the reason for that was to cover up that it's actually a wiper, and the goal is sabotage and not a criminal activity. And as we know, it went very far away with that. So NotPetya was the most destructive malware today. So it was very successful in this way, and it confused the initial incident response a lot by pretending to be ransomware, because everybody was focusing on recovery and whether to pay the ransom or not, even though that wasn't really the goal of the malware itself, right?
Yeah, that is very interesting. Tactical in that sense too. And I think, we've seen. It's also interesting you talked about the the German wiper, because that's a inadvertent case again where it's destructive actually by nature, because there is no key offered, right? There is no solution to get the data back, even though of course they under their notes in that they say that okay there is, and they hope for the victims to pay their ransom, but effectively it's still a data cryptor gone wrong in that sense. And I think it reminds us that these are cyber criminals, right? And what they promise, take it with a grain of salt, or take it with a handful of salt, because again, all the reasons we talk about not getting backed into a corner, what you should do for preventative and mitigation of this risk, because we are seeing these other cases where hey, it's not even possible to get the data back. And then as I said, we have not just the data cryptors, but also this new threat looming of the wipers, as you just talked about too. What different sorts of wiper, I know you did a deep dive on this, but what sort of different technologies, different types of wipers are you seeing out there?
I think one key differentiator is the motivation behind a wiper malware, which could be, as with German wiper, financial gain, but that's the least interesting when we talk about wipers. The other is sabotage and cyber war, and that's basically what we see now, and that's why there's this increase in wiper malware, because since the war started in Ukraine, we basically have seen like a wiper in every other week. So far we have seen 7 wipers coming out related to the war.
7 wipers. Sorry, I just wanted to pause there. That is quite incredible. Yeah, because I know we've talked about wipers before, and in your blog, the history goes back 10 years, right? I think dating all the way back to 2012 and Shamoon and Dark Soul as an example. I remember when those broke, but they're far and few in between, and like maybe once a year, if that, we would talk about something. But 7 already this year, that's a significant number, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's huge. And to go back to the differentiators, it's also interesting to talk about the techniques that these different wipers use to actually cause destruction. So the very simple ones would just look for files and replace it contents with random bytes or just 0 bytes or something like that. But then there are more sophisticated samples which would also try to corrupt the disk itself, or the master boot record to make the computer inoperational. And like for instance, in the case of Shamoon, in a scenario, it destroyed 30,000 computers at the company, which just to replace these computers is a logistical nightmare. You cannot buy like 30,000 disks in a day or two. So the destruction it can cause on a hardware level, that's also very interesting. And when we talk about wipers and ransomware as well, a really interesting aspect what we see is that they are actively looking for backup solutions. So just a simple one to find to delete the Windows shadow copy, which could be used to recover a broken Windows system. But they actually, many ransomware samples and many wipers go out and look on the network to see to find online backup solutions and to try to destroy those as well, to hinder the incident response and the recovery efforts. So that's really important, and that's why we also suggest that you don't just have to have like a backup. You have to have an offline, offsite backup that is really separated from your active environment.
Yeah,
So to
yeah,
be
it's
able to recover.
it's interesting because it's similar to the decryptors again, right? So ransomware and the data decryptors, we saw them not at first, but after a while, evolve to also look for backups of data that they can also encrypt because they don't want the recovery strategy. It's the exact same thing from what you're saying with these wipers as well. And scary, in fact, right? Because that can be automated. They can look for further systems and more collateral damage that way. And I think it's as you said, not as easy to recover from. The other interesting thing is and also scary, I think, is the way that this is heading is there's more of these capabilities being built in. So you talked about the master boot record techniques. There's the partition wipers. There's the shadow copies you're talking about. But we're also starting to see, and we've talked about this in our predictions before, but we haven't thankfully seen this again at a full scale yet. But at the worst end of the damage is firmware, wiping and bricking devices essentially as well too. There was some proof of concepts done in the past, like BrickerBot, I remember. But again, thankfully, we haven't seen this at full scale. But that's a worst case scenario because now you're not talking about recovering disks, right? You're talking about a device essentially becoming a paperweight.
Yeah, this just happened. That was the last wiper we have seen when the acid rain malware was deployed on modems around the world, so satellite modems, and basically break the modems, and this made broke communications. Like in Germany, I think 5,800 windmills got disconnected because of that. And it didn't break the modems permanently. So with a firmware update, you could bring them back. But obviously, for instance, the windmills, you have to go there physically and update the modem. So it's a lot of work, definitely.
Yeah. So where we're heading with this, we talked about, of course, ransomware, wipers, two different things, but we're starting to see some connections. Thankfully, I haven't seen it in full scale, but I think the lesson here is that ransomware is here to stay. As we talked about, not only is it becoming a more crowded space, more aggressiveness, sophistication, technology for all those reasons we've been talking about on there. We're also seeing more evasion techniques being put in. Mm-hmm. You did a blog on Pandora, right? That's another specific example where you dive deep into all the different layers of obfuscation and packers and all these things that they're doing to specifically avoid detection, right? Because we talk about the TTPs, the number one that we're seeing from cyber criminals is defense evasion. And, it's a good example, I think, of what you called out in the Pandora blog.
Yeah, absolutely. Pandora was really interesting from this point of view. From a ransomware functionality, it was as all other ransomware, but from anti-analysis and anti-reverse engineering techniques and defense evasion, it was really interesting. There was multiple layers of defense evasion techniques built in. Basically, when I first opened the sample, there wasn't anything there to look at. So I had to work really hard on basically breaking down these layers of anti-analysis techniques to be able to understand what the malware exactly does. So I think that also shows that it is worth for ransomware operators to invest time and effort into building more sophisticated malware that they can use for a longer period of time.
Yeah, and I think it's a good example of the advanced persistent cybercrime that we've been talking about. Again, it's just that sophistication level. Why? Because they've been heavily funded, right? They have more resources simply, and they can afford the time and cost to because it's from their point of view, of course, in their best interest, especially when they're doing more sophisticated targeted attacks too. So I think we're going to continue to see that happening. It's good news, bad news as always, right? The bad news is, yes, we're seeing some of this technology being weaponized essentially and developed, but at the same time, we haven't seen, in particular with some of the more advanced wipers combined with ransomware and their playbooks and the extortion models as an example. We call that out in our predictions. We haven't seen that yet in full scale. I really do think it's coming. So the good news is we have time to prepare, I think, right? And it's always good to be diligent about that. We talk about this all the time, of course, right? Being able to mitigate the risk, because this is a high risk. Everything from zero trust network access to integrated intelligence in the fabric. Segmentation is another big one too. I mean, you talked about having a piece of ransomware a wiper malware run wild on a system looking for shadow copies to delete in other systems. Again, having segmentation can actually defeat that, right? And at least give you a backup option. So all of those combined are the good news is that there's relevant defenses for that. The other good news is that we have Geri and other people on the team working on this 24/7, 365. A lot of smart people on the FortiGuard Labs team. So thanks, Geri, for your effort and work on this. If you haven't seen those blogs, you can check them out on blog.fortinet.com. Thanks, Geri, for your time. It's always a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks a lot. It was great talking to you.
You as well. This is Derek Manky with FortiGuard Live signing off.